It's been a week since part 1, and there's a lot more to add to our story about the MAX. People I'm glad not to be this week include Boeing CEO Dennis Muilenburg and test pilot Mark Forkner. But mostly Dennis Muilenburg, because he spent 2 days in front of a congressional panel last week looking into how the MAX was certified, and to put the icing on the cake, the room was full of mourners who lost family members in the 2 MAX crashes. Now, this is front page stuff, and rightfully so, because hundreds of people died needlessly, and it just seems so crazy that this happened at all. But what is it that makes this such a big deal? Well, 2 plane crashes is always a big deal, but if you ask me, it's the breach of trust. It's that Boeing, who is supposedly one of the most time-tested airframers around, the gold standard for transport category airplanes and one of the bluest of the blue chip stocks, that they effed up so bad that it seems that now even they don't know what to do. Let's take a minute to be serious here. Well, more serious. As a podcaster, I want to make it really clear that this series of episodes is not to disparage, attack, or hate on Boeing. Far from it, actually. And I think as listeners of this show, you deserve an honest, direct, and thorough listening experience. And at the end of the episode, I'm going to finally cut in and tell you what I think. But until then, though, today's show, if it ain't Boeing Part 2, it's going to keep you bang up to date on where we are with the MAX. If you're new here, this is Podcasting on a Plane. I'm Brandon Gonzalez, and this is your aviation audio magazine. We hit aviation from as many angles as possible, and my favorite 2 angles are from the cockpit and from the tower. And that's because I'm an air traffic tower controller at a busy GA airport, but I'm also a pilot, and I specialize in high-performance transition training and mentoring pilots into the complex world of our national airspace system. Or to put it more simply, you call me if you're a general aviation pilot and you want to level up your game in the plane, and of course on the radios. But if you came here just to listen to a podcast today, that's cool, because on this one, we share stories, news, and experiences that'll help you love aviation even more. Today's story started at the Aerotime News Hub. The team there provides a really nice recap article called Boeing CEO Twice Auditioned by U.S. Lawmakers on 737 MAX. It goes something like this. Dennis Muilenburg, Boeing CEO, finished the month of October by taking a 2-day-long swim in hot water. During 2 separate committee hearings, Muilenburg tried to convince the U.S. senators that Boeing is not a company which puts profits before safety. However, recurring topics of ex-employees' concern about MCAS and relation with the FAA proved the task difficult. Boeing President and CEO Dennis Muilenburg, together with Boeing Commercial Airplanes VP and Chief Engineer John Hamilton, appeared in 2 hearings on October 29th and 30th, 2019. The duo testified before the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation on the first day, and then before the U.S. House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure the following day. During approximately 8 hours of hearings, the U.S. lawmakers questioned Muilenburg and Hamilton on a range of topics, from technical aspects of the 737 MAX, its certification process, to personal accountability, outreach to victims' families, and so on. However, 2 aspects appear to be central. The alleged serious shortcomings in the Boeing company culture, quote-unquote putting profit before safety, and Boeing FAA relation, which, now is suspected, might have leaned too much on the, quote, coziness side. One important aspect of the hearings was the delegate authority process. The process is now under fire, as the FAA used it while validating the 737 MAX airworthiness. The aircraft obtained FAA's clearance to enter service in March 2017. Quote, we believe that the delegate authority process that we have today has contributed to improved safety over the last 2 decades, Muilenburg told senators during the first hearing. Quote, we're open to improving it, but the idea that we can tap the deep technical expertise from companies across the aerospace industry is a valuable part of the certification process. But the FAA is the certification authority and should continue to be. End quote. However, at another instance, the CEO also said that he supported taking a hard look at the delegation process. Several senators have suggested that Boeing's too cozy with the regulator that oversees certification of its products, a claim Muilenburg denied multiple times, arguing that they have a great deal of respect for the FAA instead. Yet the respect or lack of it for the FAA was also questioned in the light of another subtopic which received a lot of attention. Members of both committees questioned emails and messages of now ex-737 Chief Technical Pilot's emails and messages from 2016. In an email dated March 2016, he writes, quote, I confirmed with the flight controls engineers that MCAS does live in both flight control computers and only needs one to function. So given that, are you okay with us removing all reference to MCAS from the FCOM and the training manuals we discussed, as it's completely transparent to the flight crew and only operates way outside of the normal operating envelope? End quote. Even more critique was addressed to text exchange between 737 Chief Technical Pilot and another Boeing employee. In the exchange, the pilot describes his experience of MCAS activation using phrases like, quote, I'm leveling off at like 4,000 feet, 230 knots, and that plane's trimming itself like crazy. The MCAS is, quote, running rampant on me. This was egregious. Why are we just now hearing about this? And so, I basically lied to the regulators unknowingly, end quote. Muhlenberg commented, quote, "We're not quite sure what the pilot in question meant by that exchange. His lawyer has suggested that he was talking about a simulator that was in development at the time period, and that's where he was working. That could be the case, we don't know. I fully support diving deep into this and understanding what he said and what he meant." On another instance, while commenting that the pilot used a term, Jedi mind tricking, talking about foreign regulators and the 737 MAX certification in foreign countries, Muhlenberg reinstates not knowing what the pilot meant, but claims, quote, "That just does not represent the people of Boeing. It does not represent our people who work with international regulators," end quote. The description, people of Boeing, can be found in multiple company communications, including Muhlenberg's opening statements in both hearings. Quote, "There are over 150,000 dedicated men and women working for Boeing around the world, and their commitment to our values, including safety, quality, and integrity, is unparalleled and resolute. No matter what, we'll stay true to those values because we know our work demands the utmost excellence," the opening statement proclaims. Perhaps one of the biggest reasons it seems like people feel betrayed is that there's an underlying feeling that Boeing might be a little too cozy with the FAA, or at least that's what the Senate committee wants to find out. Unsurprisingly, Mr. Muhlenberg denies this, and in our next Aerotime News Hub article by Zivili Zalganate, titled "Boeing CEO Names Mistake with 737 MAX, Denies Coziness with FAA" from October 29th. He writes, "During last week's hearings, Muhlenberg commented on the exchange of messages from 2016 between the then Boeing chief technical pilot for the 737 MAX and another company's employee. In 2016, the 737 MAX was still in the development and certification stage. In the messages, one Boeing employee states he, quote, basically lied to the regulators unknowingly after describing MCAS malfunction. The malfunction described in the messages share a striking similarity to what's believed to have happened on board Lion Air Flight 610 and Ethiopian Flight 302. During the October 29th hearing, Muhlenberg told the committee he, quote, became aware of the existence of this kind of document as part of the investigation early in the year, but only became familiar with the details in the exchange, quote, recently, meaning a couple of weeks ago. Muhlenberg has also indirectly hinted that the exchange might reference problems discovered during the 737 MAX simulator testing as opposed to an actual aircraft. Muhlenberg denied that the relationship between the Boeing company and the regulator that oversees certification of his products, the FAA, is too, quote, cozy, as suggested by several senators. "We have a great deal of respect for the FAA," Muhlenberg said, but disagreed with the relationship characterization as cozy, stating that he believes in strong oversight in the aerospace industry. Hamilton, in addition, has added that Boeing has a, quote, respectful relationship with the authority, also describing it as, quote, professional rather than cozy. Ahead of the committee hearing, Boeing has released Muhlenberg's opening statement in which he admits that, quote, "We know we made mistakes and got some things wrong. We own that, and we're fixing them," end quote. Later, when questioned by the committee, the Boeing CEO provided one example of the, quote, mistakes. "We got the implementation wrong," end quote, Muhlenberg said about the AOA sensor on the MAX. In the early stages of the Lion Air Flight 610 crash, it was discovered that there was a disagreement of approximately 20 degrees between the left and right AOA sensors on the plane. Furthermore, it's also known that Boeing previously sold AOA indicator and disagree lights as optional features. The crashed Lion aircraft did not have these features installed. Now, Boeing will make the disagree light mandatory, while the AOA indicator, which takes up space on the deck, therefore is not wanted by some airlines, according to Muhlenberg, is to remain an option. Well, I guess that's that. But all legal stuff aside, there's one thing that the families may want more than anything else, and that's just an apology. Did they get it? Our next article comes from the New York Times. It's called "Boeing CEO Knew About Pilot's Warnings Before Second Crash," and it's by Natalie Kitroff and David Gellis, published October 29, 2019. From Washington, Boeing's chief executive faced the grieving relatives of two deadly crashes of its 737 MAX jet at an emotional congressional hearing on Tuesday as senators pummeled him with questions about whether the company should have grounded the plane before the second accident. At times looking shaken, the executive, Dennis A. Muhlenberg, said that if he could do it all over again, he would have acted after the first crash off the coast of Indonesia last October. Quote, "If we knew everything back then that we know now, we would have made a different decision," he testified. He said Boeing officials had asked themselves, quote, over and over again, why they didn't ground the plane sooner. Quote, "I think about you and your loved ones every day," Mr. Muhlenberg told the families, who at one point stood behind him holding up large photographs of the dead. Still, Mr. Muhlenberg acknowledged for the first time that he knew before the second crash that a top pilot had voiced concerns about the plane while it was in development. The admission will most likely lead to more questions about why Boeing didn't act more decisively before that crash of Ethiopian 302 on March 10th. 2 days later, Mr. Muhlenberg called President Trump to defend the safety of the MAX. The plane was grounded, however, on March 13th, although the United States waited longer than most countries to act. The two accidents killed 346 people and have thrown the company into crisis and roiled the global aviation industry. Mr. Muhlenberg, who had spent weeks preparing for his appearance, was measured throughout more than 2 hours of testimony. He mostly avoided being cornered by senators' lines of questioning and declined to agree to the demands that he endorsed proposals to reform aviation laws. The hearing was held on the first anniversary of the Lion Air Flight 610 crash in Indonesia. The mood in the hearing room was tense. Multiple senators asked Mr. Muhlenberg to address families of the crash victims seated behind him. The chief executive, who's been criticized for failing to convey sympathy over the crashes, apologized to the families directly in his opening remarks. "We are sorry," he said. "Deeply and truly sorry." During several tense exchanges, senators on the Commerce Committee sharply criticized Boeing's handling of the situation. Mr. Muhlenberg said in opening remarks that the company had, quote, made mistakes, and he vowed to redouble its focus on safety. Boeing faces multiple federal investigations into the design of the plane, including a criminal inquiry led by the Justice Department. Among the most intense rounds of questioning concerned messages that a pilot central to the development of the MAX sent to a colleague in November 2016, months before the plane was certified by regulators. The pilot, Mark Faulkner, said in messages that he had, quote, unknowingly lied to the FAA about a new automated system that was, quote, running rampant in the flight simulator and causing him trouble. The system, designed to help avoid stalls, ultimately contributed to both crashes. Known as MCAS, the software triggered erroneously on faulty data, sending the planes into irrecoverable nosedives. Boeing provided Mr. Faulkner's messages to the Justice Department in February, though it did not give them to lawmakers or the FAA until this month. Mr. Muhlenberg said he became aware of the messages, quote, prior to the second crash. In January 2017, 2 months after his exchange with a colleague, Mr. Faulkner sent an email to the FAA reiterating an earlier request that the regulator remove mention of MCAS from the pilot training manuals. Quote, delete MCAS, Mr. Faulkner wrote in the email, which was reviewed by the New York Times. He described the system as, quote, way outside the normal operating envelope, end quote, meaning that it would activate only in rare situations that pilots would almost never encounter in normal passenger flights. Mr. Muhlenberg said that he, quote, didn't see the details of this exchange until recently. He added that the company was, quote, not sure what the pilot meant in his messages to his colleague, and noted that the company had not been able to speak to Mr. Faulkner, who now works for Southwest. Quote, you're the CEO. The buck stops with you, Senator Ted Cruz, Republican of Texas, said, adding, quote, how did you not in February set out a 9-alarm fire to say, we need to figure out exactly what happened? Not after all the hearings, not after the pressure, but because 346 people have died, and we don't want another person to die. Mr. Muhlenberg, who appeared alongside Boeing's chief engineer, John Hamilton, remained stoic as lawmakers took turns jabbing at the company and its signature airplane. The senators pressed Mr. Muhlenberg to account for the seemingly lax oversight by the FAA, haranguing him about the close relationship between the aerospace giant and its regulator. In a report released this month, Indonesian investigators said that errors by the flight and maintenance crew contributed to the crash, but they blamed Boeing for designing a system that triggered repeatedly based on a single sensor and failing to notify pilots that it existed. A task force of 9 international regulators said in a separate report that Boeing never fully explained the system to regulators, who relied heavily on the company to help certify the plane, and did not have the expertise in place to adequately assess the information it did receive. An earlier investigation by the NTSB found that the company had underestimated the effect that a malfunction of MCAS would have on the cockpit, wrongly assuming that pilots would immediately counteract an erroneous firing. As the 737 MAX was developed, Boeing employees working on behalf of the FAA, not government inspectors, signed off on many aspects of the plane. This system of so-called delegation, which lets manufacturers approve their own work, is now under scrutiny. Boeing employees in its Seattle area and Charleston, South Carolina plants have said they sometimes felt pressure to meet deadlines while conducting safety approvals. Investigations by the New York Times have revealed that key FAA officials didn't fully understand MCAS and that the regulator at times deferred to the company, making decisions based on how much they would cost Boeing and its production schedule. Quote, Boeing lobbied Congress for more delegation, and now we have to reverse that delegation, Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat of Connecticut, said, referring to the company's push to pass legislation that undercuts the role of the FAA in approving airplanes. Quote, I would walk before I get on a 737 MAX, said Senator John Tester, Democrat of Montana, adding that, quote, you shouldn't be cutting corners, and I see corners being cut. Representative Peter DeFazio, a Democrat from Oregon and the chairman of the Transportation Committee, will add a new piece of information saying that Boeing engineers at one point proposed placing an MCAS alert inside the cockpit, according to a copy of his opening statement. No such alert was ever installed, though, and Mr. DeFazio plans to press Mr. Muhlenberg on why that decision was made. Inside Boeing, Mr. Muhlenberg's performance in front of Congress is seen as a key test of whether he'll remain in his post as chief executive, as the board weighs further management changes. This month, Boeing dismissed the executive in charge of its commercial division, Kevin McAllister, and stripped Mr. Muhlenberg of his title as chairman, in a sign that the board is moving more urgently towards holding senior leadership accountable for the crisis. Nadia Milleron, whose daughter, Samia Stumo, died in the Ethiopia crash, sat 3 rows behind Mr. Muhlenberg at the hearing and said she believed, quote, he should resign, and, quote, the whole board should resign. As Mr. Muhlenberg left the room at the end of his testimony, Miss Milleron asked him to turn and look at the people when you say you're sorry. He turned around, he looked her in the eye. I'm sorry, he said. Well, I guess they got their apology. But after an apology usually comes some sort of gesture to make things right. It's probably safe to say that the families will probably receive some sort of compensation. But is that enough? What about the people who they feel are ultimately responsible for this whole debacle in the first place? Representative Steve Cohen, a Democrat from Tennessee, asked Mr. Muhlenberg during the hearings, quote, are you giving up any money? Stephen Gandel from CBS News writes on November 1st, Boeing CEO was paid $23 million. The company has no way to get it back. On Wednesday, in front of a congressional committee investigating the 737 MAX crashes, Boeing CEO Dennis Muhlenberg was hit with a question he said he couldn't answer. Are you giving up any money? Asked Representative Steve Cohen, a Democrat from Tennessee. Muhlenberg made $23 million in 2018, according to Boeing's proxy statement, the year the first 737 MAX jetliner crashed, on top of the $49 million he earned during the previous 2 years. Cohen wanted to know whether the executive planned to return any of those millions. The CEO's answer? It wasn't up to him. That was for Boeing's board to decide. Additionally, according to a Boeing document on its corporate governance principles from this past June, not even the company's board had the ability to take back the $23 million payout. Boeing's executive compensation policies limit how much pay it can recover later if, as Muhlenberg stated in his testimony, quote, we know we made mistakes and got some things wrong. The same is true for Kevin McAllister, the recently departed head of Boeing's commercial division that produced the troubled jet. McAllister, who is described in numerous media accounts as having been fired last month, was paid more than $57 million during his nearly 3 years at the company, or roughly $1.6 million a month. And yet, Boeing can't force McAllister to pay back any of the millions he received from the company. Boeing's pay policies don't permit it. Boeing declined to answer questions about its pay practices or about Muhlenberg's or McAllister's compensation packages. Shortly after reporting its earnings last week, Boeing told employees in an internal message that the company would not pay any bonuses for 2019. The longer-term issue is called a clawback policy, which can allow a company to recover cash as well as stock compensation from an employee who later turns out did not deserve what they were paid. Clawbacks, or the lack of them at the country's biggest banks, became a hot-button issue in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. The Dodd-Frank financial reform law that was passed in 2010 instructed the SEC to write rules requiring companies to enact more aggressive clawback provisions that reach beyond instances of accounting fraud by a limited number of top executives. Those rules were never implemented. Boeing does have a clawback policy, but its language doesn't cover a disaster like the 2 737 MAX crashes that killed 346 passengers. Boeing does have a clawback policy, but its language doesn't cover a disaster like the 2 737 MAX crashes. Boeing's policy says the company will claw back, quote, incentive pay when the company has to restate financial results that were used to evaluate executive pay, when an executive leaves for a competitor, or when an executive has committed fraud. 2 years ago, Boeing added disparaging comments by former employees to its list of clawbackable offenses, but that's it. Safety lapses aren't part of the policy. Boeing's board conducted a 5-month review of the company's safety policies following the second 737 MAX crash in March and made suggestions for how Boeing could improve its safety efforts. The report was never publicly released. Executive pay policies, a Boeing spokeswoman told CBS Money Watch, weren't part of the safety review. Quote, it's the Wells Fargo problem, observed executive compensation expert Brian Foley, referring to that bank's phony account scandal, which didn't have a big impact on the bottom line, but inflicted enormous damage on the bank's reputation and brand. Wells Fargo is one of those rare examples where a board did eventually claw back a combined $136 million in pay from former CEO John Stumpf and former head of consumer banking Carrie Tolstedt. Wells Fargo's clawback provision allowed the company to recoup pay from an executive whose conduct resulted in reputational damage to the bank, something that Boeing's does not do. More companies, particularly ones hit by corporate scandals, have been adding reputational damage clauses to their clawback policies. Equifax, for example, amended its clawback last year following its massive consumer data hack to include, quote, misconduct or failure of oversight that results in significant financial or reputational harm to the company. Corporate governance expert Neil Minow told CBS Money Watch it would be a good move both for Boeing's stock price and its tarnished reputation with airline customers and their passengers if Boeing were to update its clawback policy to include safety issues. Boeing draws its clawback policy, quote, as narrowly as possible given the legal requirements, which don't mention safety, Minow said. Quote, certainly, adding that would provide some reassurance for investors and passengers. But what about the rest of Boeing's board? Mr. Muhlenberg's taken a lot of heat over this, but it's not like he's some lone wolf. Stephen Gendel also writes on October 31st that amid 737 MAX disasters, Boeing's board was busy elsewhere. On October 31st, 2019, he writes, "Last Wednesday was a big day for Boeing's lead director and new board chairman David Calhoun. It was the first time the company was reporting quarterly earnings since the Boeing board member had been named chairman of the embattled aircraft maker, which has faced intense scrutiny since two 737 MAX jets crashed within months of each other in the past year, killing 346 people. Boeing's latest quarterly earnings had plunged more than 50%. It wasn't Calhoun's only corporate announcement that day. He's also the highest-ranking independent director on the board of Caterpillar. On the same day Boeing was announcing its latest financial results, the construction equipment giant also reported disappointing earnings. Adding to the juggling, Calhoun's day job is as a top executive and a member of the management committee at publicly traded Blackstone Group, the largest private equity firm in the world, with ownership stakes in some 200 companies. Guess when Blackstone announced its quarterly earnings? Last Wednesday morning, and that's when it released results that beat analyst estimates. Calhoun's a prime example of a phenomenon that corporate governance experts call, quote, overboarding. On top of his roles at Boeing, Caterpillar, and Blackstone, he's chairman of the board of Blackstone-controlled Gates Industrial, a publicly traded manufacturer of propulsion systems with 15,000 employees worldwide. Overboarding is a critical issue for corporate watchdogs who scrutinize whether company directors, paid hundreds of thousands of dollars annually for their part-time work, in Calhoun's case, $366,000 for Boeing alone in 2018, are fulfilling their management oversight duties. When a company runs into a crisis as severe as Boeing's 737 MAX woes, that oversight becomes even more critical. A case in point is the aviation giant itself, whose board stripped longtime CEO Dennis Muhlenberg of his chairmanship earlier this month and handed the duties to Calhoun. About 31% of the directors at companies in the S&P 500 stock index sit on 3 or more boards of public companies, according to executive recruiting firm Spencer Stuart. At the time of the first 737 MAX crash in October 2018, 62% of Boeing's board members served on 3 or more company boards. The number of Boeing directors on 3 or more boards fell to 54% this past May, 2 months after a second 737 MAX crash led to worldwide groundings of the jet, when former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley replaced Republican White House veteran Kenneth Duberstein, who sat on 3 other corporate boards. The 3 boards percentage dropped again last Friday to 43% when Boeing added a new board member, retired Admiral John Richardson. But even for Richardson, Boeing won't be his only S&P 500 board. He was also appointed last month to the board of Exxon, the $45 billion energy company. All told, 12 of Boeing's 14 board members, or 86%, sit on at least one other public company board, and that compares to an average of 64% across S&P 500 companies. Of those 12 Boeing board members with at least one other board commitment, 9 have full-time jobs elsewhere. 6 of Boeing's 14 board members now serve 3 or more corporate boards, and 2 serve 4 boards. Quote, shareholders of Boeing should be concerned, says Charles Elson, a business professor and corporate governance expert at the University of Delaware, in reference to how many of the company's directors sit on multiple boards. Elson said that was particularly true for Calhoun, who is the newly installed chairman of Boeing's board, plays a key role in helping steer the company through crisis. Quote, it would be ideal if he had stepped down from one of his roles, Elson said. Calhoun declined numerous requests for comment. A Boeing spokesperson said Calhoun's board chairman role at Gates Industrial should be seen as part of his Blackstone responsibilities. Then there's Susan Schwab, a former U.S. trade representative who's both a professor of public policy at the University of Maryland, as well as an advisor to the law firm Mayer Brown. Like Calhoun, Schwab sits on the boards of both Boeing and Caterpillar. She's also on the boards of hotel chain Marriott International and shipping giant FedEx. Schwab, through a Boeing spokesperson, said both her University of Maryland and Mayer Brown roles are part-time, and that she's not been employed at any full-time capacity since taking on her 4 corporate board positions. The Boeing board's other 4 bagger is retired insurance executive Edward Liddy, who ran Allstate for years and briefly served as chief executive of AIG during the financial crisis. His other boards these days include 3M and the drug companies Abbott Laboratories and AbbVie. The typical S&P 500 board seat is no longer the cushy retirement perch it may have been in decades past. Quote, from cybersecurity to accounting to executive compensation, there are more demands on board members than there used to be, said Barney, who's head of the U.S. Aerospace Defense and National Security Practice recruiting firm Odgers Berndsen. While the hours spent on board meetings may be manageable, the hardest part of serving on numerous boards often comes down to scheduling. The general rule is 240 hours a year per board if everything goes perfectly, but that quickly becomes exponentially higher if there's a problem, said Neil Minow, one of the nation's top experts on corporate governance. Boeing is the dictionary definition of a problem. In a statement to CBS Money Watch, Boeing defended its board of directors and their workloads. Quote, the Boeing board of directors is deeply engaged, possesses a diverse set of experiences, and provides timely and actionable guidance and oversight for the company said in a statement. Quote, "The significant experience of our directors outside of their roles at Boeing contributes to their ability to oversee the company effectively. The board has also adopted corporate governance policies, which we disclose on our website, implementing safeguards to ensure that other commitments, including outside board memberships, do not affect directors' responsibilities on our board." CEO Muhlenberg told a Senate committee Tuesday that shortly after a Lion Air 737 MAX crashed into the sea, minutes after takeoff last October 29th from Jakarta, a team of Boeing engineers and executives was convened to investigate the cause of the accident. He didn't say if that group came to any conclusion or if the board was part of that process. In May, Calhoun told the Washington Post that the Boeing board had been briefed on the 737 MAX and its safety systems following the October Lion Air crash. But he said that he and others concluded the malfunction, quote, "looked like an anomaly." A company proxy statement filed March 2019, about a week after the second 737 MAX crash of an Ethiopian Airlines flight, moments after takeoff from Addis Ababa, shows the Boeing board met 7 times in 2018, the same number of meetings as the previous year. The board's governance committee, also in charge of risk oversight, met 6 times last year, also the same as in 2017. Quote, "The board and its committees meet regularly," a Boeing spokesman said in response to CBS Money Watch questions about whether the board held any emergency or special meetings in between the 2 crashes. The company declined to answer questions about whether Boeing directors who serve on other boards have considered paring back on their commitments. Quote, "We don't comment on board discussions," the spokesman said. In April 2019, after the second crash, Boeing's board created a temporary aerospace safety committee to review the company's practices. In August, following the review recommendations, the company made the board's safety committee permanent, akin to a board audit committee or a compensation committee. Boeing also removed a layer of management overseeing safety issues, effectively giving more control over those decisions to Muhlenberg. 3 Boeing board members have experience in the airline business: Muhlenberg, who's worked at Boeing since he was a college intern; Lawrence Kellner, former chief executive of Continental Airlines; and Calhoun, who once headed General Electric's jet engine division. Much of Boeing's board seems more connected to Washington, D.C. than anywhere else, including former Trade Representative Schwab, former UN Ambassador Haley, 2 retired admirals, and former Ambassador to Japan Caroline Kennedy. Muhlenberg works for only one other corporate board, Caterpillar, along with Calhoun and Schwab. He also sits on the boards of Northwestern University, the Business Roundtable, the Aerospace Industries Association, the National World War II Memorial, the Congressional Medal of Honor Foundation, and the science education nonprofit FIRST. In his first public testimony since the 2 deadly crashes, the Boeing chief executive on Tuesday told a Senate committee that he was briefed about the contents of internal messages indicating a company test pilot had concerns about the safety of the 737 MAX in early 2019, at least a month before the Ethiopian Airlines crash. But Muhlenberg said he'd only learned the details of the messages and emails in the past few weeks. A House hearing on Wednesday produced more evidence that Boeing employees had voiced safety concerns over the MAX prior to the first crash, as well as production ramp-up pressures tied to Boeing's global backlog of commercial jet orders. Consumer advocate Ralph Nader, whose grandniece died in the Ethiopia crash, last week called on Boeing's board and management to resign. On Chairman Calhoun, Nader told CBS News, quote, "There's no way he can do this job and do all those other jobs. Boeing's in a tremendous crisis." End quote. Well, unfortunately, even with all that, there's still more to add to the whole situation. On October 31st, CBS News also reported that dozens of Boeing 737 NG jetliners are grounded worldwide due to cracks. Boeing announced that up to 50 of its popular 737 NG planes had been grounded after cracks were detected in them, in another blow to the U.S. aircraft maker following 2 deadly crashes, they write. Australian national carrier Qantas became the latest airline to take one of the planes out of the air, as it said it would urgently inspect 32 others, but insisted passengers had nothing to fear. The announcement by Qantas came after authorities in Seoul said 9 of the planes were grounded in South Korea in early October, including 5 operated by Korean Air. Boeing had previously reported a problem with the model's pickle fork, which is a part that helps bind the wing to the fuselage. This prompted U.S. regulators earlier this month to order immediate inspections of aircraft, which had seen heavy use. Following the Qantas announcement, a Boeing spokesman on Thursday told the AFP in Sydney that less than 5% of the 1,000 planes had cracks detected and were grounded for repair. The spokesperson did not give an exact figure, though 5% equates to 50 planes out of 1,000 inspected. Boeing and Qantas stressed that travelers should not be concerned. Quote, "We would never operate an aircraft unless it was completely safe to do so," Qantas head of engineering Chris Snook said. But the discoveries heightened fears that the scale of the 737 NG's problem might have been underestimated. The U.S. FAA had initially ordered immediate checks of 737 NG planes that had flown more than 30,000 times. But Qantas said that it had found a fault in more lightly used aircraft than those singled out for early checks, one that had recorded fewer than 27,000 flights. Quote, "This aircraft had been removed from service for repair," Qantas said in a statement, adding that it had hastened its inspections of 32 other 737 NG planes to be completed by Friday. The airline said it generally used the aircraft on domestic routes, flying primarily between major cities, as well as shorter-haul trips to New Zealand. A spokesman for Australia's aviation regulator said the industry response was about, quote, nipping a potential safety problem in the bud by taking proactive action now. Australia's Virgin Airways also conducted checks on its 17 737NGs and didn't find any issues, the regulator spokesman added. But there were calls for Qantas to ground its entire 737 fleet until the checks were complete. Quote, these aircraft should be kept safe on the ground until urgent inspections are completed, an Engineers Union representative Steve Purvinus said in a statement. Qantas described the call to ground its 737 fleet as, quote, completely irresponsible. Even when a crack is present, it does not immediately compromise the safety of the aircraft, said Snook. Stephen Fankhauser, an aviation expert at Australia's Swinburne University of Technology, said the parts were designed so that the, quote, structure can tolerate some level of damage or degradation. The inspection period is set to ensure the cracks do not continue to grow to a dangerous length and then significantly compromise the strength of the airframe, he said. A Boeing spokesperson said the company, quote, regrets the impact the issue is having on its customers and was, quote, working around the clock to fix the problem. Quote, Boeing is actively working with customers that have airplanes in their fleets with inspection findings to develop a repair plan and to provide parts and technical support as necessary, the spokesperson said in a statement. So, as airlines that operated the MAX are affected by the MAX's grounding, we've already talked about the financial toll that it's going to take, but even the pilots union at Southwest is suing for lost income. What about the suppliers, though? One of the biggest suppliers to Boeing is GE. They manufacture the engines that power the MAX. We know that Boeing is still manufacturing MAX airframes to keep up with the backlog and because they anticipate a fix to be approved soon. The interesting part, though, is that GE seems surprisingly optimistic about the situation. From CNBC, Michael Sheets and Leslie Josephs report, GE to lose $1.4 billion this year from MAX grounding, but expects the jet's return. General Electric continues to burn cash at its aviation business as the grounding of Boeing's top-selling 737 MAX caused GE to delay production of engines for the aircraft. This year, GE's logged significant working capital losses from headwinds to its business, with Chief Financial Officer Jamie Miller telling shareholders on Wednesday, quote, a big chunk of that's the 737 MAX. GE manufactures the LEAP engines used for the 737 MAX, which has been grounded worldwide following 2 deadly crashes in the past year. We still expect this year to be impacted to the tune of about negative $1.4 billion, Miller said of delays in the aircraft engine production during the company's third quarter earnings call. Still, GE's key aviation business logged an 8% increase in revenue during the third quarter from the same period last year, climbed to $8.1 billion from $7.5 billion. That's in part because the company sold 455 LEAP engines during the quarter, 50% more than a year earlier. As we think about 2020, I think we're going to try to follow Boeing's lead here, CEO Larry Culp said. Quote, when we talk about the full-year cash headwinds this year due to MAX, that obviously assumes that we don't see a return to service this year, end quote. GE's current forecast is, quote, a conservative financial planning assumption, Culp added. What we have seen in the second half, and we've seen it third quarter and will continue to see in the fourth quarter, is an acceleration of LEAP 1B shipments in anticipation of the MAX return to service, Miller said. While Miller says the ramp in LEAP production depends on when and how regulators reintroduce the 737 MAX into commercial service, GE expects the airplane will begin flying again. Boeing still expects the 737 MAX to get regulatory approval before the end of the year, although no U.S. airline has the aircraft scheduled to fly until 2020. All right, well, I'll tell you what, I've had enough of the heavy stuff for now. Let's have a little quote-unquote fun. So last time we talked about Southwest looking at adding another aircraft type to its famously all 737 fleet. Over at avgeekery.com, they've been thinking it over, and it seems they've come up with a list of 4 possible alternatives to choose from. Are you as curious as me? All right, well, the article is mostly a recap of what we've already covered, so I'll start in the middle. Right when they ask the question, what could Southwest choose? The AvGeeks over there write, even without an immediate push to acquire a second fleet, we're AvGeeks, and we love talking about the what-ifs of the aviation industry. If Southwest decides to pursue a second fleet, they have a number of options on the table that they could select from, and one fanciful one that makes us think, what if? Let's look at 4 potential options. Number 1, if Southwest does decide to diversify the fleet, the obvious choice would be to seek parity or near parity with the 737 MAX. The A320 family offers seating in similar range between the 737-700 and 737-800 with the A319 and 320. They also offer an attractive A321 NEO fleet that includes the longer-range LR and forthcoming ultra-long-range XLR. The latter could open up routes from the east coast of the U.S. to Western European destinations. What makes a straight NEO buy unlikely is that an NEO really doesn't offer much additional capability for the airline. It is true that an A320 fleet would reduce the airline's vulnerability to a fleet-wide grounding. However, it would add complexity in both crew scheduling and maintenance without significant operational gains. Like the larger 737-9 offering, Southwest still would have challenges operating the larger A321 at their Midway Airport focus city due to runway length. The jet would also not open up many new markets because the size and range is so similar to the existing fleet. Number 2, the A220 is a really interesting option for Southwest. the jets currently offered is a Dash 100 and Dash 300. The smaller version seats about the same as the Boeing 717. The larger one approaches the same category as their existing 737-700 fleet. The A220's efficiency at the Dash 300 model was better than the 737 MAX 7 due to a lighter structure. A220 also features a very comfortable cabin and a support network of Airbus. What makes the jet so unique is that the MAX-like efficiency and range, but in a smaller package. Southwest could potentially unlock new markets with an A220. Hawaii to similar cities like Albuquerque, Tucson, or Reno become doable. Long-distance thin routes like Boise to Fort Lauderdale could prove profitable too. As an additional bonus, Southwest would have the same aircraft as Moxie, a proposed startup with the goal to connect cities in the U.S. that are not currently connected. Number 3. With Boeing's acquisition of Embraer, the Embraer E190-E2 offers an opportunity for Southwest to technically stay all Boeing while getting a smaller jet. The E2 offers many of the same advantages as the A220. Both jets are efficient. Where the Airbus has an advantage is range. The E2's range is sufficient for transcontinental flights and even has the range to Central America from Houston Hobby. However, its range is more in line with the existing 737NG fleet. Flights to Europe or South America on a Southwest E2 jet won't happen. And number 4, let's put this in the near fanciful but possible category. The Boeing 787 offers Southwest an efficient way to offer long-haul service. Over the past few years, Southwest has expanded beyond its traditional route structure as the airline added Central America and Hawaii. It's conceivable that they could add a second type for long-haul service. As cool as it might be to sit down in a Southwest Dreamliner, we're guessing that the odds are pretty low. A 787 wouldn't really help Southwest diversify their fleet unless the airline acquired a number of them. The 787 would be too big to operate at Chicago Midway and a few other markets that it currently serves. And most importantly, the relatively small fleet size would mean that the airline would not really significantly reduce risk if there was another MAX-like grounding that would affect the 737 fleet. And lastly, not going to happen, but hey, what if? Back when Southwest merged with AirTran, they acquired 88 Boeing 717 jets. At the time, Southwest said they planned to retain the jets, but less than a year later, the airline announced an agreement with Delta to lease them the jets in a sweetheart deal that included Southwest paying for refurbishment. At the time, it was a smart move. The 717 wasn't much cheaper to operate than the 700, even though it had less seats. It also would have introduced operational complexities before Southwest had the upgraded computer technology to easily deal with such a challenge. But today, with 34 MAX jets grounded and Delta flying the 717s in Southwest's own backyard, we have to wonder how Southwest might have grown differently with the two types operating within the airline. So place your bets. If we were betting, we'd think that Southwest would focus on returning the MAX to service and controlling growth by removing aging 737NGs as necessary. But I also think we can't rule out an A320 or an A220 in Southwest livery one day. What do you think? Do you think we might see a non-737 jet in Southwest colors one day? Well, if you ask me, I say, I don't know. Definitely maybe though, and it's sure fun to think about. Before we finish, I want to take a minute to thank the patrons of the show who find value in it and who have chosen to make per-episode contributions on Patreon.com. People like Daniel Sternberg. He paid me a visit recently along with husband Phil in their new Phenom 300 jet. Congrats on the insurance minimums, guys. Also Patrick Smith. He visited me the other day and he maintains flight simulators for the military while he's out here. It's pretty cool stuff. I thank them and all of our other patrons for their support. And if the subscription-based model isn't for you, there's a link to buymeacoffee.com/BravoGolf at podcastingonaplane.com. While you're there, you can pledge just $3 one time and I'll send you a personalized thank you. Anyway, I've talked a lot during this episode about what everybody else thinks. But what do I think? Well, I want Boeing to fix this. I want Boeing to return to form, making the best airliners in the sky. And I want the culture there to reflect the best that manufacturing practices can be, and that companies everywhere want to emulate. We want to be just like Boeing, they'll say proudly. I want Boeing to be a symbol of American leadership that we can all be proud of. And maybe most important of all, I want to be able to say beyond a shadow of a doubt once again, that if it ain't Boeing, we ain't going. And I know they can do it. Good day.
I'm Chris Dunn from theflyingweatherman.com. The Podcasting on a Plane podcast is presented for entertainment purposes only. Brendan's comments and those of his guests, the website's content, and any of the social media, etc. are not part of his official responsibility as a controller or as an FAA employee. The views and opinions you hear on the podcast are his and those of his guests, and not necessarily that of the FAA. There is no nexus between Podcasting on a Plane and the FAA. Also, while he's a CFI, he's not acting as your CFI. qualify, nor is he your mechanic, your doctor, your shrink, or your spouse. This podcast is presented for entertainment, camaraderie, and fun, but is in no way, shape, or form professional advice or legal counsel. If you're in need of professional advice, get some from somewhere more appropriate than a podcast, no matter how good this one may be.